I never thought I'd become an entrepreneur at 65. Retirement was supposed to be about gardening and occasional visits from my children and grandchildren. At least that's what my husband Frank had always planned for us. But life rarely goes according to plan, does it? The morning everything changed, I was standing in our kitchen, still wearing the black dress from Frank's funeral. 3 weeks had passed, but I couldn't bring myself to put it away. The coffee in my mug had gone cold hours ago, just like the reality I was facing. Alone for the first time in 43 years, with a mortgage I couldn't afford, and a family that viewed me as nothing more than Dad's widow now. My daughter Melissa's voice cut through my thoughts as she placed a hand on my shoulder. "Mom, we need to talk about what you're going to do now." Her tone was gentle but laced with something that made my stomach tighten, concern mixed with impatience. I looked up to see her exchanging glances with my son-in-law, Robert. They'd been staying with me since the funeral, allegedly to help, though it mostly involved hushed conversations that stopped whenever I entered a room. "What do you mean?" I asked, although deep down I already knew. Melissa sat down across from me, arranging her face into what I recognized as her dealing with difficult clients expression. As a successful realtor, she had mastered the art of delivering uncomfortable news. "The house, Mom. It's too big for just you, and the property taxes alone." She trailed off, glancing at Robert for support. He cleared his throat. "What Melissa is trying to say, Catherine, is that it might be best if you sold the house. You could move into something smaller, maybe even that senior living community we looked at last year." The one Frank said reminded him of a hospital waiting room? I replied, surprised by the edge in my voice. Their faces fell slightly, but they pressed on. Over the next hour they laid out what they called the practical solution. Sell my home, move into a retirement community, and live off what remained of Frank's life insurance after paying off the mortgage. My son David would call later to reinforce this plan, they assured me. "We just want what's best for you, Mom," Melissa said, reaching for my hand. "At your age, you shouldn't have to worry about maintaining a house or making ends meet." "At my age?" Those 3 words hung in the air between us. I nodded along, playing the role they expected, the bereaved, slightly confused widow who needed guidance from her more capable children. It was a role I'd unconsciously been rehearsing for years, as Frank made the financial decisions and I deferred to his judgment. I had been a kindergarten teacher before retiring 10 years ago, but in my family's eyes, that career had been little more than a hobby compared to Frank's position as bank manager. After they left the kitchen, satisfied they'd made their point, I remained at the table, staring at the pile of bills and paperwork I'd been avoiding. Frank had always handled our finances, not because I couldn't understand them, but because it was easier to let him take control while I managed our home and family life. Now, I felt the weight of my own complicity in their perception of me. I picked up the mortgage statement, then the property tax bill, then the insurance documents. With each page something shifted inside me. Not despair but clarity. Numbers had never intimidated me. I taught basic math to 5-year-olds for decades. I could certainly understand our financial situation. 3 hours later, I was still at the kitchen table, but now surrounded by neatly organized piles and a legal pad filled with calculations. The reality was sobering but not as dire as my children had implied. If I was careful and found some income source, I could keep the house for at least a year before making any drastic decisions. But what kind of income could a 65-year-old retired kindergarten teacher generate? The answer came from an unexpected place. A box of Frank's belongings that David had brought down from the attic earlier that week. Inside, tucked between old tax returns and fishing equipment receipts, was a leather-bound recipe book. Not just any recipes, but my recipes, the ones Frank had lovingly compiled over our decades together. My apple pie that won the county fair 3 years running. The chili that our neighbors begged for every winter. The sourdough bread that had started with a starter Frank's grandmother had given us as a wedding present. I ran my fingers over the handwritten notes in the margins. Catherine's best. Neighborhood favorite. Better than the bakery downtown. That night I couldn't sleep. My mind kept returning to those recipes, to the joy I'd always felt feeding people, to the compliments and requests for cooking tips I'd received over the years. By dawn, an idea had taken root, one that seemed simultaneously ridiculous and perfectly sensible. The next morning I called Beth, my closest friend since we'd taught together at Lincoln Elementary. "I'm thinking of starting a small baking business. I blurted out as soon as she answered. There was a pause on the other end. Catherine, honey, are you okay? It's not even 7 a.m. I'm serious, Beth. I could start small, just bread and pies at first. Maybe sell at the farmer's market. Another pause. Have you talked to Melissa or David about this? I felt a twinge of annoyance. I don't need their permission. Of course not, Beth backpedaled. It's only been a month since Frank passed. Big decisions should wait, don't you think? Apparently not when it comes to selling my house and shipping me off to Sunny Pines Retirement Village, I replied, more sharply than I intended. Beth sighed. They suggested that already? Those kids never waste time, do they? We talked for another hour. By the end, Beth wasn't exactly enthusiastic, but she agreed to help me research what I'd need to start a small home baking business. As a recent retiree herself, she had time on her hands and, I suspected, her own concerns about becoming irrelevant. I waited 3 days before mentioning my plan to my children. I chose to do it during our weekly Sunday dinner, which had become a somber tradition since Frank's passing. Melissa, Robert, and their teenage son Tyler were there, along with my son David, his wife Jennifer, and their 2 young daughters. My youngest, Michael, joined via video call from Seattle. I waited until dessert, a blueberry pie that had everyone asking for seconds, before I made my announcement. I've decided what I'm going to do, I said, pouring coffee for everyone. I'm starting a baking business. The silence that followed was broken only by the clink of Michael setting down his mug on the other side of the country. Then came the laughter, first from David, a short, incredulous chuckle, then from Robert, more openly amused. Mom, be serious, Melissa said, placing her fork down. This isn't the time for jokes. I'm perfectly serious, I replied, keeping my voice steady. I've looked into the requirements for a home-based food business. Pennsylvania has cottage food laws that would allow me to sell baked goods I make in my own kitchen. David exchanged glances with Jennifer. Mom, do you have any idea how competitive the food business is? People spend years building their brands. Not to mention the physical toll, Melissa added. You can barely unload the dishwasher without complaining about your back. That was when I had a slip disc last year, I corrected her. I'm fully recovered. Michael's voice came through the speaker. Guys, maybe we should hear Mom out. What exactly are you thinking of selling? I felt a rush of gratitude toward my youngest. Bread primarily. Pies. Maybe those Christmas cookies everyone always fights over. Robert let out another laugh. Catherine, with all due respect, well, it's a retirement hobby, not a business. You'd need licenses, insurance, marketing. All of which I've researched. I cut in, sliding a folder across the table. Beth and I spent the week looking into everything I'd need. The startup costs are minimal since I already have most of the equipment. David didn't even glance at the folder. Mom, I appreciate that you're trying to find a way to stay busy, but this isn't realistic. You've never run a business. Dad handled all the finances. And now Dad is gone, I said quietly. So I'll handle them myself. Melissa reached for my hand. Mom, we're just concerned. Starting a business is stressful at any age, but at 65. Let me stop you right there, I interrupted, pulling my hand away. My age doesn't define what I'm capable of. Julia Child was 49 when she published her first cookbook. Colonel Sanders was 65 when he started Kentucky Fried Chicken. You're comparing yourself to Colonel Sanders? David scoffed. Mom, be realistic. The conversation deteriorated from there. Each of my children took turns explaining why my idea was foolish, impractical, or downright irresponsible. Even Michael, initially supportive, eventually suggested I start smaller. Maybe just bake for the church bake sale. Only Tyler, Melissa's 16-year-old, seemed genuinely interested. Grandma's bread is better than anything at the store, he offered, before being silenced by a look from his father. By the time they left, the consensus was clear. I was having some kind of grief-induced crisis, and the baking business was a fantasy I would soon abandon. David took me aside at the door. Mom, I know you're trying to find purpose after Dad, and that's good, but this isn't the way. Why don't you volunteer at the library or join that book club Beth is always talking about? I smiled tightly. I'll think about it. After they left, I sat alone in the kitchen, surrounded by the remains of the dinner, and the untouched folder containing my business plan. For a moment, doubt crept in. Maybe they were right. Maybe this was just a desperate attempt to avoid facing the reality of my new life. Then my eyes fell on Frank's photograph on the refrigerator. He was smiling that crooked smile I'd loved for more than 4 decades, the one that appeared whenever he was particularly proud of something I'd done. Like the time I went back to college to finish my teaching degree while raising 3 children. Everyone had doubted me then, too. I picked up the folder and opened it again, reviewing the notes Beth and I had made. The next morning, I filed the paperwork for Catherine's Kitchen and ordered my first set of business cards. The first month was harder than I'd anticipated. I converted a corner of my garage into a prep area, investing in a second-hand commercial mixer and extra baking sheets. Pennsylvania's cottage food laws meant I could legally sell from my home kitchen, but I still needed to meet health standards and obtain the proper certifications. Each step brought new challenges that kept me awake at night, wondering if my children had been right after all. Beth was my rock during those early weeks, helping me navigate the bureaucracy and serving as my first taste tester. "This sourdough could be sold in New York City," she declared after trying the first official loaf of Catherine's Kitchen bread. My first real test came at the Spring Valley Farmers Market in early May. I'd secured a spot at the biweekly event, paying the modest fee from my dwindling savings. The market manager, a woman in her 40s named Diane, had been skeptical when I applied. "We already have 2 bakery vendors," she'd said over the phone, her voice suggesting she was doing me a favor by even considering my application. "Do they specialize in artisan sourdough and heirloom recipe pies?" I'd countered, surprised by my own confidence. There had been a pause. "No, it's mostly muffins and cookies. But our customers tend to like trendy foods, gluten-free, vegan, that sort of thing." "I can adapt," I'd assured her, thinking of the applesauce spice cake recipe I'd modified for a student with egg allergies years ago. "And I think you'll find that good bread never goes out of style." The night before my first market, I barely slept. I'd been baking since 4 a.m., producing 12 loaves of sourdough, 8 bowls of my cranberry walnut bread, and 6 each of apple and blueberry pies. My back ached, my fingers were raw from kneading, and doubt had set in again. What if no one bought anything? What if everyone saw me as the pathetic old woman my children seemed to think I was? Beth arrived at 6 a.m. to help me load my car. "Good grief, Catherine, did you sleep at all?" "An hour or 2, I admitted, wrapping the last pie in baker's twine. I kept changing my mind about which recipes to bring. Beth surveyed the kitchen, which looked like a flower bomb had detonated. "Well, whatever you decided on, it smells divine." The farmer's market was already bustling when we arrived at 7:30. Young families with strollers, couples with reusable shopping bags, elderly folks getting their exercise. The demographic was diverse, but I couldn't help noticing I was one of the older vendors by at least a decade. I'd invested in a simple setup: a folding table covered with a checkered cloth, a chalkboard sign with my offerings and prices, and a stack of business cards Beth had helped me design. Nothing fancy but neat and professional. The first hour was slow. People walked by, glanced at my display, and kept moving. A few stopped to admire the pies, but nobody bought anything. By 9 a.m. I was fighting back tears behind my forced smile. Beth kept reassuring me it would pick up, but I could see the concern in her eyes. Then a small miracle happened. Mrs. Rodriguez, whose son I'd taught 15 years earlier, recognized me. "Miss Catherine, I didn't know you were a baker now." She approached my table with genuine delight. "Just starting out," I admitted. After Frank passed, I needed something new to focus on. Her face softened. "I'm so sorry about your husband. But this," she gestured to my display, "this is wonderful. Miguel still talks about the bread you made for that class pioneer project. He said it was the best he'd ever tasted." She bought a loaf of sourdough and an apple pie. As she was paying, she asked if she could take a picture for her Facebook page. "I know at least 3 friends who would love these pies." By noon, I'd sold half my inventory. Mrs. Rodriguez's post had apparently reached more than just 3 friends. Several customers mentioned they'd seen my bread online and had to try it. One woman bought 3 loaves, saying her book club was meeting that night and they always needed good bread with their wine. When the market closed at 2 p.m., I had exactly 2 loaves and 1 pie left. Beth was beaming as we packed up. "I'd call that a success, wouldn't you?" I nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. It wasn't just the sales, though the $340 in my cash box was certainly encouraging. It was the comments, the appreciative noises people made when they sampled my bread, the way they closed their eyes and smiled. For the first time since Frank died, I felt genuinely useful. That evening, exhausted but exhilarated, I called each of my children to share the news. The responses were telling. Melissa: "That's nice, Mom, but don't get too excited about one good day." David: $300? That's barely minimum wage for all those hours. Michael at least seemed genuinely impressed. Way to go, Mom. Did you take pictures for Instagram? You should definitely have a social media presence. I hadn't thought about social media at all. At my age, Facebook was about as tech-savvy as I got, and even then I mostly just liked photos of my grandchildren. But Michael's suggestion stuck with me. The next day, with Beth's teenage granddaughter's help, I created Instagram and Facebook pages for Catherine's Kitchen. To my surprise, social media became a vital part of my business. People loved the story of a 65-year-old widow starting fresh. Every post about my baking process or the history behind a recipe garnered comments and shares. When I mentioned that my sourdough starter was over 4 decades old, originally from Frank's grandmother, the post went mini-viral in our local food community. By the end of the second month, I was selling out at every market. I added a midweek baking day to fulfill special orders that were coming in through my newly established website, courtesy of Michael, who built it remotely. The garage conversion expanded to include a second refrigerator and more storage shelves. Not everyone was thrilled with my success. My children, particularly Melissa and David, remained skeptical. They'd stopped mentioning selling the house, but now they worried about my health. "Mom, you can't keep pushing yourself like this," Melissa said during one of her visits, eyeing the flour on my apron and the timers I had set for 3 different doughs. "Your blood pressure has actually improved," I finished for her. "Dr. Patton says I'm in better shape now than I was a year ago. Apparently, kneading dough is good exercise." She frowned. "But the stress of running a business is nothing compared to the stress of feeling useless," I replied, more sharply than I intended. Her expression shifted from concern to hurt. "We never said you were useless. You didn't have to say it," I said, turning back to my work. "It was in every suggestion that I downsize my life to match your expectations." The conversation ended awkwardly, as they often did these days. My relationship with my older children had become strained, a reality that pained me even as I refused to let it derail my new path. 3 months in, I hit my first major obstacle. Diane, the market manager, informed me that there had been complaints from the other bakery vendors. Apparently, my increasing popularity was cutting into their sales. "They've been with us for years, Catherine," she explained apologetically. "They're threatening to leave if we don't implement some kind of balance." "What does balance mean?" I asked, already suspecting the answer. She couldn't quite meet my eyes. "They're suggesting we limit your offerings to just bread or just pies, not both. Or possibly rotate vendors, so you'd only be here bi-weekly instead of weekly." I felt a surge of indignation. "So because I'm successful, I'm being penalized?" Diane sighed. "It's not personal. It's just business." Those words, "It's not personal, it's just business," echoed in my head all the way home. By the time I reached my kitchen, a plan was forming. If the farmer's market wouldn't accommodate my full range, I'd find another venue, or create my own. The solution came from an unexpected source. Tyler, Melissa's son, had started helping me occasionally on baking days. Unlike his parents, he found my business fascinating and had picked up bread-making techniques with impressive speed. "Why don't you do a subscription service?" he suggested one afternoon as we shaped sourdough loaves. "Like a bread CSA. People pay up front for a month of deliveries." I paused, flour-covered hands hovering over the dough. "A bread subscription?" Tyler nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, like those meal kit services, but for your bread. You could have different tiers, just bread, bread and pie, special occasion packages." The idea was brilliant in its simplicity. I could maintain a steady customer base without depending solely on the farmer's market. Plus, knowing exactly how many orders I had each week would reduce waste and allow for better planning. With Tyler's help, and despite his parents' visible disapproval of his involvement, I launched Catherine's Kitchen Bread Club the following week. The response exceeded all expectations. Within 10 days, I had 30 subscribers, a mix of regular market customers and newcomers who'd found me through social media. The success brought new challenges. My home kitchen, even with the garage extension, was reaching its capacity. I was baking 7 days a week just to keep up with orders. Beth, who had appointed herself my unofficial business manager, suggested it was time to consider hiring help. "You can't do this all yourself, Catherine," she insisted after finding me asleep at the kitchen table, surrounded by cooling racks of bread. "You'll burn out." She was right, of course. But hiring help meant officially acknowledging that this wasn't just a hobby or a temporary distraction from grief. It was a real business with real potential. It also meant facing the fact that I'd need more space and possibly a commercial kitchen to meet health regulations if I expanded further. The decision was made for me when I received a call from Greenfield Senior Living, the upscale retirement community on the other side of town. Their food services director had tried my bread at a friend's house and wanted to discuss a potential wholesale arrangement for their dining room. "We're always looking to partner with local artisans," she explained. "Our residents appreciate quality, and from what I've tasted, your bread would be a wonderful addition to our menu." The proposed order, 40 loaves weekly with seasonal variations, would nearly double my production. There was no way I could handle it from my home kitchen, not while maintaining the bread club and special orders. That night I called a family meeting. All 3 of my children, plus their spouses and Tyler, gathered in my living room. Even Michael flew in from Seattle, a sign that he at least was taking my business seriously. "I have an opportunity," I began, outlining the retirement community's offer and what it would mean for Catherine's Kitchen. "But to accept it, I need to make some changes." I laid out my plan: rent a small commercial kitchen space, hire 2 part-time assistants, and invest in professional equipment. The total startup cost would require using most of what remained of Frank's life insurance, money my children had assumed would eventually be their inheritance. The reaction was immediate and divided. Michael was enthusiastically supportive, offering to help research kitchen spaces and even suggesting he could remotely manage the business's growing online presence. Tyler was equally excited, volunteering to work part-time after school and on weekends. Melissa and David, however, were aghast. "Mom, this is crazy," David exploded. "You're talking about investing tens of thousands of dollars into a hobby. A hobby that's already profitable," I corrected him. "I've been tracking every expense and sale. The numbers work." Melissa shook her head. 6 months ago, you were a retired kindergarten teacher who could barely use Facebook. Now you want to be some sort of bread mogul." The way she said it, like it was the most ridiculous thing imaginable, made something snap inside me. "Yes, Melissa, that's exactly what I want," I replied, my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. "I want to be a bread mogul at 65. I want to build something that's mine, that makes me happy, that lets me use skills I've developed over a lifetime. And frankly, I don't need your permission or approval to do it." The room fell silent. Jennifer, David's wife, was the first to speak. "I think it's wonderful," she said quietly. "My mother always regretted not pursuing her own dreams after raising us. She felt invisible in her later years." David shot her a betrayed look, which she ignored. "The business is already successful," Michael pointed out. "Mom's not asking for money, just support. Why is that so hard?" Robert, who had been silent until now, cleared his throat. "It's a significant risk at Catherine's stage of life." "At my age, you mean," I said flatly. "Let's not dance around it. You all think I'm too old to start something new. Too old to learn. Too old to succeed." No one denied it, which was answer enough. "Well, I'm doing it anyway," I continued. "With or without your blessing. I've found a small commercial kitchen for rent near the community college. I've interviewed potential assistants, and I've already accepted the Greenfield contract." The meeting ended with no resolution. David and Melissa left angry, barely saying goodbye. Michael stayed an extra day to help me finalize plans for the kitchen rental. And Tyler, defying his parents' obvious disapproval, committed to working with me on weekends. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. The commercial kitchen needed minor modifications to suit my specific needs. Equipment had to be purchased, schedules coordinated with my 2 new part-time assistants, both culinary students from the community college, and recipes scaled up for larger production. I moved my baking operations to the new space in early September, exactly 6 months after that first day at the farmer's market. The opening day was both terrifying and exhilarating. For the first time, I wasn't doing everything myself. Elena and Marcus, my assistants, followed my directions with respectful attention, asking intelligent questions and offering suggestions from their culinary training. By mid-morning, the kitchen was filled with the intoxicating aroma of fresh bread. I felt a surge of pride as I surveyed the rows of perfectly shaped loaves cooling on the racks. This was mine. I had built this from nothing but grief and determination and decades of unrecognized skill. The Greenfield Senior Living delivery went out that afternoon. 40 loaves of various types, each bearing the Catherine's Kitchen label Tyler had designed. The bread club packages followed, now expanded to 50 members. By the end of the day, I was exhausted but more fulfilled than I'd felt in years. As fall turned to winter, the business continued to grow. Word of mouth spread through Greenfield, bringing inquiries from 2 other senior communities in neighboring towns. A local cafe asked about featuring my bread on their menu. The holiday season brought a flood of special orders for dinner rolls, specialty breads, and holiday pies. I hired 2 more part-time workers and extended the kitchen lease to include additional storage space. Tyler's weekend involvement evolved into a formal position as my social media manager, a role Melissa reluctantly accepted after seeing his genuine passion for the business. The success brought an unexpected side effect. My relationship with my older children began to shift. It started subtly, Melissa asking more detailed questions about the business during Sunday dinners, David mentioning my bread to colleagues at his accounting firm. There was still skepticism, but it was tempered now with something that looked almost like respect. The real turning point came just before Christmas, when the local newspaper ran a feature on senior entrepreneurs redefining retirement. The reporter had interviewed me at the kitchen, taking photos as I demonstrated my bread-making technique. The resulting article was prominently featured in the Sunday business section, complete with a large color photograph of me shaping a loaf, flour dusting my gray hair, looking focused and competent. David called the morning the article appeared. "Mom, I just saw the paper," he said, his voice containing a note I hadn't heard before. "It's impressive." "Thank you," I replied, waiting for the qualifier that usually followed his rare compliments. Instead, he surprised me. I showed it to Jennifer's father. "He's been thinking about starting a woodworking business since he retired. Your story really inspired him." "Really?" I couldn't keep the surprise from my voice. "Really," he confirmed. "And well, it got me thinking too. I've been helping some of my accounting clients develop business plans for years, but I've never asked if I could help you." The offer hung between us, an olive branch and acknowledgement, perhaps even an apology. "I could use some help reviewing my tax situation," I admitted. "Things have gotten more complicated than I anticipated." By New Year's, both David and Melissa had become informally involved in different aspects of Catherine's Kitchen. David reviewed my books and set up a more sophisticated accounting system. Melissa, with her real estate connections, helped me navigate a lease expansion when the space next to my kitchen became available. 1 year after Frank's death, 10 months after that first farmer's market, Catherine's Kitchen had 6 part-time employees, contracts with 4 senior living facilities, a thriving bread club with over 100 members, and a dedicated following at 2 farmers' markets. I was working harder than I had in decades, but the satisfaction far outweighed the exhaustion. The anniversary of Frank's passing fell on a Sunday. After visiting his grave in the morning, I hosted a dinner for the entire family. As we gathered around the table, my 3 children and their spouses, all 5 grandchildren, and Beth with her husband, I felt Frank's absence keenly but not in the way I had expected. Instead of emptiness, there was a sense of continuation, of life moving forward in new and unexpected directions. After dinner, as we sat in the living room with coffee and pie, Melissa cleared her throat. "Mom, we've been talking," she began, glancing at her brothers. "We, the 3 of us, have a proposal for you." I set down my coffee cup, instantly wary. "What kind of proposal?" Michael jumped in. "A business proposal, actually. We think Catherine's Kitchen is ready for the next level of growth. And we want to be part of it," David added. Officially. They outlined their idea. Form a family LLC, with me as the majority owner and each of them taking smaller stakes. David would handle finances, Melissa would manage facilities and expansion, and Michael would oversee technology and branding from Seattle, with quarterly visits. Even Jennifer and Robert had roles they could fill with their respective skills in marketing and supply chain management. I listened in stunned silence as they laid out a vision for Catherine's kitchen that was far more ambitious than anything I'd considered. Multiple locations, a line of packaged goods for retail, possibly even a small-scale cafe concept. When they finished, all eyes were on me. A year ago, I would have been overjoyed at their interest, desperate for their approval. Now, I felt something different, caution mixed with measured optimism. Why now? I asked simply. The question hung in the air. It was Tyler who broke the silence. Because you proved them wrong, Grandma, he said with the brutal honesty of youth. They didn't think you could do it, but you did. Now they want in. Tyler, Melissa admonished, but I held up a hand. Let him speak, I said. I want to hear what everyone really thinks. What followed was the most honest conversation our family had had in years. There were admissions of underestimating me, of making assumptions based on my age rather than my capabilities. There were apologies, some sincere, others still tinged with reservation. The truth is, Mom, David finally said, you've built something impressive, something with real potential. And yes, we should have supported you from the beginning. But we'd like to support you now, Michael added. If you'll let us. I looked around at their faces, my children now middle-aged themselves, who had thought they knew what was best for their aging mother. A year ago, their doubt had hurt me deeply. Now, I found I could look at it with more understanding. They had been afraid for me, worried I would fail, concerned about my well-being in the vulnerable time after losing Frank. I took a deep breath, gazing at my family surrounding me. The people who had laughed at my dreams were now asking to be part of them. There was a poetic justice to it that wasn't lost on me, but I also felt a surge of wariness. I appreciate the offer, I said carefully, and I'm touched that you all see value in what I've built. But I need to think about this. Melissa's face fell slightly. What's there to think about, Mom? This is a good thing. We'd be working together as a family. That's exactly what I need to consider, I replied. Catherine's kitchen has succeeded because I've had complete freedom to make decisions, take risks, and follow my instincts. A family business means compromise, group decisions, and potentially conflict. David leaned forward. Mom, we're not trying to take over. You'd still be majority owner. On paper, I acknowledged. But we all know how family dynamics work. The moment there's disagreement, it becomes about more than just business. Michael, always the peacemaker, spoke up. What if we start smaller? Maybe consulting roles rather than formal ownership? That way you maintain complete control, but still get the benefit of our expertise. I smiled at him, grateful for the suggestion. That might be a better first step. Let me think about the specifics. The conversation shifted to other topics, but I could feel a new undercurrent of excitement among my children. They were already envisioning themselves as part of the business, making plans, seeing possibilities. It was both flattering and concerning. Later, after everyone had gone, I sat alone in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd stood in my funeral dress a year ago, feeling lost and diminished. Now it was just one of two kitchens I oversaw, a base of operations for a thriving business that bore my name. Frank's photograph still hung on the refrigerator. I looked at it, imagining what he would say about all this. They underestimated me, Frank, I said to the empty room. Just like you sometimes did. It wasn't said with bitterness. Frank had been a wonderful husband in many ways, but he'd been a man of his generation, raised to see certain roles as fixed and separate. He'd never fully understood my restlessness, my sense that there should be more to life than what I'd been allowed to pursue. Now I had found that more, and at an age when most people were settling into comfortable routines of retirement. The irony wasn't lost on me. The next morning I called Beth. Over coffee at her kitchen table, I laid out my children's proposal and my reservations. They want in now that you've proven it works, Beth observed, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. Can't say I'm surprised. Am I wrong to hesitate? I asked. They're family after all, and they do have skills that could be valuable. Beth gave me a long look. Catherine, do you remember when you first told them about the business? How they laughed. I nodded, the memory still carrying a sting. People who don't believe in you during the struggle don't deserve equal partnership in the success, she said firmly. That doesn't mean you can't work with them, but it should be on your terms. Over the next week, I thought carefully about what those terms would be. I consulted with my small business attorney, another new addition to my life, and drafted a proposal of my own. When I called the family together the following Sunday, I was ready. I've given your offer a lot of thought, I began, once everyone was settled in the living room, and I've come up with a counter-proposal. I distributed copies of the document I'd prepared. I'm establishing Catherine's Kitchen as a formal corporation, with myself as CEO and majority shareholder. I'm offering each of you the opportunity to purchase a small equity stake, 5% each, at a fair market valuation. David's eyebrows shot up as he scanned the document. These terms are standard for any business investment, I finished for him. You'd be investing in the company, not receiving ownership as a gift. In addition, I'm open to hiring each of you as consultants in your areas of expertise, with clear scopes of work and compensation. Melissa looked up from the papers, her expression a mix of surprise and something else. Respect, perhaps. This is very professional, Mom. It's a business, I replied simply. It should be treated as one. What followed was a detailed discussion about valuation, expectations, and roles. Michael immediately agreed to my terms, both for the equity purchase and a consulting arrangement for digital marketing. David and Melissa were more hesitant, clearly having expected a more informal, family-centered arrangement. I need you to understand something, I said, looking each of them in the eye. When I started this business, none of you believed in me. You thought it was a grief response, a hobby at best. You were wrong, and that's okay, I've forgiven that. But it means you didn't take the initial risk with me. So you can't expect equal reward now. The room fell silent. David's jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he might argue. Instead, he nodded slowly. That's fair, he admitted. More than fair, actually. By the end of the evening, we had reached an agreement. All 3 children would purchase the offered equity stakes, and each would provide consulting services in their areas of expertise. Tyler, to his immense pride, would be hired officially as our social media manager, with a formal salary rather than the loose arrangement we'd had before. As they were leaving, Melissa hung back, waiting until the others had moved toward their cars. Mom, she said hesitantly, I owe you an apology. A real one. I watched her face, seeing real contrition there. When Dad died, we all just assumed. We thought you needed to be taken care of. She shook her head. I never stopped to consider that maybe you were capable of more than we gave you credit for. It's a common mistake, I replied, thinking of all the women my age who'd been underestimated by their families, by society, by themselves. We're taught to see aging as decline rather than evolution. She hugged me then, tighter than she had in years. I'm proud of you, she whispered. And I'm sorry we laughed. That night, I sat at my kitchen table updating my business journal. A habit I'd started when Catherine's Kitchen was just an idea scribbled on a legal pad. I wrote about the family meeting, the new agreement, and my feelings about bringing my children into the business I'd built without them. Then I wrote something else, something that had been forming in my mind for months. A mission statement for Catherine's Kitchen that went beyond bread and pies. It would be a business that valued experience, that saw potential in places others overlooked, that created opportunities for people in the third act of their lives. The following week, I hired my 3rd full-time employee, a 58-year-old former office manager who'd been unable to find work after her company downsized. Within a month, she was managing our operations with an efficiency that impressed even David. 2 months later, I brought on a retired chef who'd been bored with golf and fishing to develop new product lines. By the 18-month mark, Catherine's Kitchen had moved to a larger facility, expanded to 15 employees, 7 of whom were over 50, and launched a packaged goods line that was being carried in specialty stores across 3 states. The Bread Club had evolved into a subscription service with different tiers and options, managed through a website Michael had built specifically for our needs. My children had settled into their roles as consultants and minority shareholders, respecting the boundaries I'd established while contributing valuable expertise. David's financial guidance had helped us navigate a tricky expansion. Melissa's connections had led to contracts with 2 upscale grocery chains. Michael's digital marketing strategies had built our online presence far beyond what I could have achieved alone. At our first formal board meeting, held in my dining room with Beth taking minutes, we reviewed the company's performance and discussed future directions. The numbers were impressive. Revenue had tripled year over year, and projections for the coming year were even stronger. "I think we need to consider a retail location," Melissa suggested. "A flagship store where people can see the bread being made, maybe with a small cafe component." David nodded. "The numbers support it. We've built enough brand recognition locally to justify the investment." I studied the proposal they'd prepared, impressed with the thoroughness of their research and the reasonableness of their projections. This was a far cry from the dismissive attitude they'd shown when I first mentioned starting a business. "I like the concept," I agreed. "But with one addition. I want to include a training program for older workers looking to re-enter the workforce or start new careers in food service." Michael grinned. "That fits perfectly with the brand story we've been developing. It's never too late to rise to new challenges." The tagline, which he'd coined for our packaging, had resonated strongly with customers. Our social media was filled with comments from people inspired by the story behind Catherine's kitchen. Not just the bread itself, but what it represented. "That reminds me," Tyler spoke up from his place at the end of the table. He was now a college freshman, still managing our social media between classes. "We've had 3 requests this month for Grandma to speak at events. One's a women's business network, one's a retirement planning seminar, and one's a high school entrepreneurship class." I blinked in surprise. "Me? Why would they want me to speak?" Tyler looked at me as if I'd asked why the sky was blue. "Because you're inspiring, Grandma. You started a successful business at 65 when everyone told you it was impossible. People want to hear that story." 2 years to the day after Frank's funeral, I stood at a podium in the community center, facing a room of about 70 people who had come to hear me speak about late-life entrepreneurship. In the front row sat my family, all 3 children, their spouses, my grandchildren, and Beth, who'd recently accepted a part-time position as our HR manager. 2 years ago, I began. I was a widow in a black dress, being told by well-meaning family members that it was time to downsize my life, to accept less, to fade quietly into what they considered an appropriate old age. I paused, looking at my children, who smiled encouragingly despite the reference to their past attitudes. Instead, I decided to rise to new challenges, literally in my case since I make sourdough. The audience chuckled. "I want to talk to you today about what I've learned from starting a business at 65, about the unique advantages that come with age, and about why it's never too late to pursue a passion that might just change your life." As I spoke, I saw heads nodding in the audience. Older men and women who understood exactly what I was describing. The feeling of being dismissed, overlooked, underestimated. Younger people listening with surprised interest, perhaps reconsidering their assumptions about what was possible in later life. After the speech, as people lined up to talk with me, an elderly gentleman approached, leaning heavily on a cane. "I'm 82, he told me, his voice wavering slightly. "Been thinking about writing a mystery novel for 30 years. My kids say I should just enjoy my retirement, not stress myself with new projects." "And what do you think?" I asked. He straightened as much as his curved spine would allow. "I think I'll start chapter 1 tomorrow." Later that evening, my family gathered at my house for dinner. The conversation flowed easily, touching on business matters, family news, and plans for the future. As I looked around the table, I realized how much had changed in 2 years, not just in terms of Catherine's kitchen, but in how they saw me and perhaps most importantly in how I saw myself. David raised his glass. "To Mom, who proved that 65 is just the beginning of what's possible." "To Catherine's kitchen," Michael added. "From skepticism to success. To second acts," Melissa said softly. "And to having the courage to pursue them." I lifted my own glass, thinking of Frank, of the life we'd had together, and the unexpected new life I'd created afterward. "To believing in yourself," I said, "even when no one else does." As we clinked glasses, my phone buzzed with a notification. Tyler, seated beside me, glanced at it and grinned. Your speech is already getting shares on social media, he reported. The hashtag never too late to rise is trending locally. I laughed, still not entirely comfortable with the idea of being an inspiration to others. I had simply done what felt necessary at the time, found a way to support myself, to maintain my independence, to create something meaningful when everything familiar had been taken away. And yet, looking around at my family, at the business we were now building together, at the community that had formed around Catherine's kitchen, I understood that what had begun as survival had become something much more significant. It had become a testament to resilience, to reinvention, to the possibilities that remain open at every stage of life. My family had laughed when I started a business at 65. Now they were working alongside me, learning from me, proud to be associated with what I'd built. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. After dinner, as everyone helped clear the table, Melissa approached me in the kitchen. "You know," she said quietly, "I used to worry about you being alone after Dad died. I thought you needed us to take care of you." I smiled, loading plates into the dishwasher. "And now?" She laughed softly. "Now I think we needed you more than you needed us. You've taught us all something important, Mom." "What's that?" I asked. "That it's never too late to become more fully yourself." Later that night, after everyone had gone, I stood in my kitchen, the original home of Catherine's kitchen. The space that had once seemed like a desperate last resort now felt like the birthplace of something precious. Not just a business, but a new understanding of what I was capable of. On the refrigerator, Frank's photo still smiled his crooked smile. Next to it now hung the front page of the business section featuring Catherine's kitchen, the certificate from the Chamber of Commerce naming us Small Business of the Year, and a card from my youngest granddaughter that read simply, "Grandma, when I grow up I want to be brave like you." I touched each item gently, thinking of all the turns my life had taken to bring me to this point. How a period of grief had opened a door to possibility. How rejection had fueled determination. How, at 65, I had discovered strengths I never knew I possessed. Outside, snow was beginning to fall, dusting my garden with white. In the spring, that garden would be expanded to grow herbs for our newest bread varieties. The basement was being converted into a test kitchen, where I would train other older adults interested in culinary careers. The business was growing, evolving, creating ripples far beyond what I'd initially imagined. I switched off the kitchen light and headed upstairs, pausing at the window to watch the snow falling silently in the darkness. Tomorrow would be another early morning, bread to bake, decisions to make, a business to run. But tonight, I allowed myself a moment of quiet celebration for the woman I had become when no one was looking. The woman who, at 65, had learned that it's never too late to rise.